So after releasing my video on the 4Vs that I think are killing modern pop music, I got a comment accusing me of racism, of promoting censorship, of musical fascism. And those are some pretty serious charges that I thought I should respond to. Let me first say that working in the realm of ideas is really hard. If you have something worthwhile to say, chances are it's novel. It might be hard to communicate and hard to get across clearly. And new ideas are magnets for critics and naysayers. I understand this is a professional hazard, it comes with the territory, and if you want to work in the realm of ideas, then you can't be thin-skinned. So what exactly did this person say? You can go read the comment if you want the full thing, but I'm going to give you the highlights reel and my responses to it. All right, so the first point that I think needs addressing, this commenter writes, I understand your perspective. The idea that popular art should reflect the values that lead to a healthy society is logical and reflects ethical hopes and beliefs for our future. But actually, that is not my perspective at all, and I think it has some pretty pernicious ideas baked into it that lead this commenter to some of his or her conclusions. My perspective, as I've elaborated in several videos and will continue to elaborate, has nothing to do with a healthy society. It has everything to do with the individual. My perspective is that the individual should carefully consider his context and the music that he is consuming and make good decisions on the basis of factors that perhaps he's never really considered before. Note the big thing here though. This is an individual's decision based on that person's own context, which only he or she knows. Only he or she can make that determination. Musical responses are inherently individual, and the best that I or anyone can do is look at the content of music, the way that it is presented, and draw out what might be general tendencies for how people might respond to something. And that's precisely what I did in my video on the 4Vs. This whole healthier society idea, as we'll see in the rest of this person's comment, is that it comes with the notion that we can somehow achieve the common good by making decisions for people, by banning a whole range of options and thereby taking them off the table entirely. But that's worlds away from merely counseling individuals to think deeply about their own context and make their own decisions that will help them lead better lives. He goes on to say, history shows that upholding popular art to some moral standard harms marginalized groups more than it benefits society as a whole. What you are arguing for, intentionally or not, is censorship, wherein people with power suppress countercultural movements when they threaten the status quo. Now, the root problem with this claim is that the commenter apparently does not know the meaning of the term censorship. Censorship does not mean expressing your ideas, convincing other people that they are true and that they should act on those ideas. If that were the case, the comment itself would be a form of, or at least an attempt at, censorship. The commenter is trying to convince me of an idea and get me to act differently on the basis of it. Let's consider some actual examples of music censorship. Goosh Goosh is an Iranian singer and former actress. She's one of the most popular and prolific entertainers in Iranian history. She was at the height of her career in 1979 when Ayatollah Khomeini came to power and imposed strict Sharia law. Think of Taylor Swift today, for instance, being told tomorrow that she can no longer make music. That's what happened to Goosh Goosh. And it's not only women who are censored in Iran. Mosam Najjoub, who's been called the Bob Dylan of Iran, had to flee the country in 2008 because his sly lyrics and mixtures of Persian and Western melodies offended the clerics. And if he goes back, given the history of the morality police there in Iran, it's pretty likely that he will not only end up in prison, but maybe end up dead. What happened in Iran when the Ayatollahs took power is much like what happened also in the Soviet Union during the Great Purge under Joseph Stalin, when essentially the government took control of what artists could and could not publish. Loads of Russian artists fled the Soviet Union and went elsewhere. They went to the West, where they had some measure of artistic freedom. And today, Russian censorship may not be as all-encompassing as it was during the Soviet Union, but it still exists. Monotachka, for instance, was branded as a foreign agent and was forced to flee the country, in essence, after she criticized the Putin regime for internet censorship and the like. And the rapper Face fears going back to Russia because if he does, it's pretty likely that in retribution for his criticisms of the regime, he'll be sent to the front lines in Russia's stupid war against Ukraine. Now, this is just an indication of the widespread censorship throughout the non-civilized world. Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, North Korea, China, lots of people throughout the world do not have the freedom of speech that we have, and that includes musical artists. Now, how does a guy with a YouTube channel expressing his views on music measure up to the censorship apparatus of Russia, or China, or Iran, or North Korea? Name your figure. I will bet that every artist that I've been talking about has been or was subject to lots of private criticism, whether from professional music critics or just the average listener. But do you think any of them would have equated that with censorship? No, because they know that there's a massive difference, a world of difference between someone expressing their criticism and a government using force to silence them. This again is why I say that this commenter just apparently doesn't know the meaning of the term censorship. It doesn't mean expressing your views and convincing other people to act on those views. It means using the power of government to outlaw certain forms of expression. For another example, look at Brazil today, where Alexandre de Moraes is using the power of government to silence his critics, from social media influencers to comedians to democratically elected politicians. And as a stout supporter of free speech, as someone who's married to a Brazilian and who has family in Brazil, I've done what I can to empower and encourage Brazilians to speak out against this oppression. The fact that I regard freedom of speech as an absolutely do or die value for any form of civil society obviously does not mean that I have to shut my mouth, relinquish my standards, stop criticizing music. I mean, this would be an absolutely absurd result of having freedom of speech, having to stifle one's thoughts so as not to censor or oppress somebody by expressing those thoughts. Now, although clearly I'm disappointed at a comment like this, I don't really hold it against the commenter for not knowing what censorship is, particularly if this person is young, given the rise of cancel culture. There's a widespread misconception today, popularized by postmodernist philosophy, that expressing a controversial point of view is somehow equivalent of using force against those who don't hold that view. But it's a simple, observable fact that expressing ideas is worlds away from forcing those ideas on other people. And when we equate those two things, when we equate expressing ideas with a form of force, what we end up with is actual censorship, as is happening in Brazil and countless other countries in the world today. And by the way, if you want a good book on this subject, check out Free Speech by Jacob Mashingamba. Similarly, I don't think this commenter knows what the term racist or racism means. He goes on to say, "John, I think you're being a racist. I don't think you're being malicious, but the conclusions of your research have led you to arrive at the same ideas of racists." And he goes on to say that my conclusions are racist because 17 of the 22 songs that I criticized in my 4Vs video are by or feature black artists. And I also don't mention any of the, quote, gross and lecherous songs from the glam metal era directed at underage women in my section on vulgarity. Now, honestly, I find this accusation just mind-blowing. In fact, when I told my wife about it, she literally laughed out loud and said, "That's the funniest thing I've ever heard." Not only do I have a history of advocating freedom of speech, but I've also written articles celebrating the heroes of abolitionism, plotting the moral courage of Rosa Parks, and so on. Now, I don't expect that this person has any awareness whatsoever of my history in this work. So setting all of that aside, let's just focus on what racism is and what it means. Racism means judging a person not on the basis of the content of his character, but on the color of his skin. Now, I actually think that some of the greatest musicians, including pop musicians of all time, have been black musicians, but the fact that they were black is completely irrelevant to my evaluation of them as musicians. Go back to that video, watch it again. You'll see that my focus is entirely on music and the ideas conveyed in it. Someone, anyone, please point out to me any instance in which I've linked the ideas conveyed in music or the tendency to exhibit these negative trends to skin color. On the other hand, this commenter actually treats people's musical tastes and whether or not they exhibit the 4Vs as actually dependent on skin color. He writes, countercultural movements represent the opposite of prevailing cultural values. This often means embodying the 4Vs to set themselves apart from the status quo. And then he goes on to say, the fall of rock and roll and the rise in hip-hop and dance pop has allowed black people and LGBT people to be more understood and accepted because they have become familiar voices to largely segregated audiences. Where the hell are these segregated audiences, by the way? This person is saying here that blacks and LGBT people use what I'm calling the 4Vs and criticize as being negative trends as a means of, I don't know, apparently standing out and being more understood somehow. Now, that's the commenter's argument, and notice that the commenter is the one linking what one believes and the aspects of one's musical expression to unchosen characteristics like one's skin color or sexual orientation. So whoever you are, I have to repeat your own criticism back to you. I don't think that you're being malicious, but to think that the fall of rock and roll and the rise of hip-hop and dance pop somehow reflects the growing social power of black people in general, as if all black people like the same music, is, in my view, a racist idea. And I also think, by the way, that the pioneers of rock and roll, people like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Chubby Checker, Ray Charles, would be pretty upset by the view that rock and roll is somehow inherently white and the stuff that unseated it is somehow more representative of an entire race. In actual fact, every individual is unique, makes his own decisions on the basis of his own values, and should not be regarded as liking one thing or promoting one thing or another on the basis of his or her skin color. Now, to underscore the point, race has absolutely no bearing on my evaluation of music. I spelled out in that video on the 4Vs my reasoning, and that reasoning has nothing to do with skin color. If I were trying to list the greatest pop artists and the greatest pop songs of history, I would bet that, once again, black artists would stand out more prominently than those of other races. Michael Jackson, Ray Charles, Stevie Wonder, Chuck Berry, Bruno Mars, Bill Withers, Louis Armstrong, The Supremes, Otis Redding, Roberta Flack, Prince, Whitney Houston, Beyonce, Alicia Keys, John Legend. The accomplishments of black artists is absolutely outstanding, but guess what? It has nothing to do with the fact that they're black. The reason that in my 4Vs video I didn't include any examples of vulgarity from the gross and lecherous songs from the glam metal era directed at underage women is because, to my knowledge, there are no such examples. In the history of the Billboard year-end top 10, I can find no examples of this. So if you think I'm wrong, again, please point them out to me. And in this context, it's worth spelling out again why I'm focused on the year-end top 10 Billboard hits. I mean, Rick Beato's pretty commonly accused of comparing apples and oranges because he'll take the top songs from today and compare them to masterpieces of yesteryear that never came anywhere close to the top 10 of the Billboard charts or any other charts. So that's the reasoning. I'm looking at specifically these songs because I want to give us a fair analysis of the history and trajectory of pop music. Lastly, this commenter writes, I sincerely believe you are not a racist or a fascist or even mean any harm at all, but I believe your ideas about what makes art valuable are harmful. I appreciate your confidence that I'm not a racist or a fascist. I'm not. All in all, although I entirely disagree with your comment, I do appreciate you taking the time to make it, and also to give me this opportunity to clear the air about some of these things that maybe you're not the only person confused about. As always, if you want to show me you care, like, subscribe, and share.